Hello everyone, welcome back. We're going to pick up right where we left off. So we had just finished discussing the idea of what is called a dictator, someone who has veto power, and dummies. Okay, so we're gonna do this example here with the three different quota levels that they give us, and just practice identifying who's a dictator, who has veto power, and who are the dummies. Okay, so here we go. So in this first one, they want us to put in a 10 for Q. So I'm gonna write out my weighted voting system here. I'm gonna say 10 and then 10 comma 5 comma 3. Okay, so indicating that the quota is 10. I have 3 players and their weights are 10, 5, and 3. Okay, so for dictators, we do have a dictator in this particular election. That's going to be player 1. And that is because player 1 has enough weight to pass a measure all by himself. He's got a vote of 10. The quota is 10, so he can pass a measure all by himself, right? So if you are a dictator, something to remember is that if you're a dictator, you also have veto power, which means no one can pass a measure without you, and everyone else is a dummy. Okay, so if anyone is a dictator in any election, everyone else in that weighted voting system is automatically a dummy. They are not essential to any voting scenario. Okay, so let's go with the next one. This time we're going to change the quota to be 12, and the weights remain the same. Okay, so quota is 12. We have 3 players with weights 10, 5, and 3. So this time we do not have any dictators, right? Because the highest amount of weight that any one player has is 10, and the quota is 12. So no one can pass a measure by themselves. But we do have veto power. Okay, so player 1 does have veto power here, because if the other 2 were to team up and create a coalition here, then they still do not have enough weight to pass a measure unless they get player 1 on board. And if they can get him to agree, then they can pass a measure. But unless player 1 agrees, you're never going to pass a particular measure. You're never going to be able to make a decision. Okay. So dummies. Do we have any dummies in this one? Well, no, we actually don't have any dummies. And the reason being is because let's say 5 dropped out of the race. Like if let's say 5 disagreed and player 1 and player 3 decided to team up, well, that would be 13 votes. And those 3 votes are essential to that alliance to be able to pass the measure. So there is a scenario in which player 3 is considered critical. All right? And if player 3 here is critical, then player 2 and player 1 are also critical because they have a higher number of votes. So there are no dummies. All right? Last voting system here, we're going to up the quota to 16, and the weights remain the same. So we have no dictators. That's really easy to spot because the highest weight is 10, the quota is 16, so there's no one who can pass a measure by themselves. And then we look at veto power. Okay, so I'm going to start with the 10. Okay, so if this particular player has veto power, then the other 2 would not be able to team up and pass a measure without him. And they cannot, right? Because 5 and 3 is only 8. They need 16. So player 1 has veto power. Now, player 2 has veto power if the other 2 try and team up and they still can't pass a measure. So if player 1 and player 3 team up, they would only have 13 votes. That's still not enough to pass a measure. So player 2 would also have to agree. So player 2 has veto power. And then let's look at player 3. If player 1 and player 2 were to team up, they would only get 15 votes. That's not enough to pass a measure, so they would have to get player 3 on board. So that means player 3 also has veto power. So we have all of them having veto power in this situation. And if you have veto power, you're automatically essential to some voting scenario, so that would mean that no one is a dummy. All right. Let's go to the next idea here, and that is, you've heard me use this word a couple of times, and I wish they would introduce us a little earlier in the book, but they talk about this idea of a coalition. All right, and the definition of a coalition is right down here. A coalition is any group of players that decide to vote the same way. So when I talk about these team ups or these alliances, like when player 1 and player 3 get together, or player 1, 2, and 3 get together, I'm describing coalitions because they are groups of players that have agreed to pass a measure. They're going to go ahead and vote the same way. All right, so that is a coalition. Now, a coalition is considered a winning coalition if when they team up, they have enough weight to meet the quota. Okay. And then this other idea, we talked about it a little bit when we were discussing the dummies, but the idea that someone is critical in a coalition. So if you have a team or a coalition that you have created, if anyone could leave that coalition and you go from a winning coalition to a losing coalition, that person is critical, right? Because you need them for your coalition to be successful. All right, so let's look at an example, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more depth here. All right, so this example talks about Scottish Parliament, and it describes the Scottish Parliament in 2009, and they have 5 different political parties, which is kind of crazy, right? Because we come from a country that essentially only has 2 political parties. They have 5, all right? And they are called the Scottish National Party, Labour Party, Conservative Party, Liberal Democrats, and the Scottish Green Party. All right, so they have 5 different parties, and when you're in a party together, you are agreeing to vote the same way. So they vote as a block. So the Scottish National Party has 47 votes that are all going to go the same way. The Labour Party has 46 votes that are all going to go the same way. And you start to see how this becomes a weighted voting system. So you think of the party themselves as the players, and the number of representatives becomes their weight. Okay? So this is the voting system that is being described by Scottish Parliament. Right? So they're telling us that we have to get 65 votes to pass a measure. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different players, and the weights are as such. Right? So we're going to consider a coalition. Right? So remember, this is just a team up of different players. So we're going to consider the coalition player 1, player 3, and player 4. They are all going to vote the same way. So that would be player 1, player 3, and player 4. Right? These 3 parties are going to vote the same way. The question is that a winning coalition? Well, I need to add up their weights. Right? So I'm going to grab my calculator here. And I'm going to add that up real quick and see if they are able to reach quota within their coalition. Okay, so we're going to do 47 plus 17. Oops. And plus 17. I did that in the wrong order, but that's okay. So 47, so they get 80 votes, right? So this coalition together has 80 votes to try and pass a measure. So yes, this would be a winning coalition because they only need 65 votes to pass a measure. So now the question is anyone critical? Okay, so when I look at these, like if to determine if someone is critical, we pretend that somebody is going to leave the coalition. Let's say that player 4 decides, nah, I don't think this is the coalition for me. I don't want to team up with these guys, so I'm leaving. So now this coalition only consists of player 1 and player 3. So I would add up the 47 and the 17 and see if they still have enough votes. Okay, so if I do 47 plus 17, we get 64 votes. Okay, so that's not enough, right? So if player 4 leaves, they only get 64 votes. Well, they need 65 to pass the measure, so we now know player 4 is critical. And if player 4 was critical because they had 16 votes, well, then player 3 would be critical because they have even more. So if player 3 left, player 1 and player 4, who remain in the coalition, would not be able to pass a measure anymore. So player 3 is also critical. And obviously if player 4 and player 3 are critical, player 1 is going to be critical because player 1 had 47 votes. There's no way you're going to pass a measure in your coalition without player 1. All right, so let's try it again. This time let's add a new person to our alliance. We're going to add player 5, and The difference there, player 5 adds another 2 votes to our coalition. So we now have 82 votes with this coalition. So if they were all to vote the same way, they would easily pass a measure because they only need 65. But now we run the scenarios of, let's say one of these parties gets unhappy and they decide that they're going to go. All right, so let's see if player 5 is critical. Let's pretend that player 5 says, you know what, this isn't the right coalition for me, we're leaving. All right, so they go from 82 back down to 80. 80 is still enough to pass a measure, so player 5 is not critical. We really don't need player 5, as long as player 1, 3, and 4 stay in the coalition. Now let's pretend player 4 gets upset and leaves the coalition. So now we would be taking away 16 votes. So I'm going to go to my calculator, and I'm going to do 82 votes minus the 16 from player 4. And we are left with 66. And 66 is still enough. All right, we can still pass a measure with those 66 votes. So player 4 is not critical either. All right, so let's see if player 3 is critical. Okay, so now player 3 gets upset. They say, I'm going to leave this coalition. The other 3 remain. So I'm going to go to my calculator, and this time I'm going to do 82 minus 17 votes, right? Because player 3 had 17 votes. So that still leaves us with 65 total votes, which is enough to pass a measure. So even player 3 is no longer critical. All right. So now let's pretend player 1 gets upset and says, nope, I don't want to be a part of this coalition anymore. So I'm going to grab my calculator here. I'm going to take 82 votes. I'm going to subtract away the 47 votes that player 1 has, and that only leaves us with 35. So in that scenario, player 1 is critical. You have to have player 1 on this team if you're going to pass a measure. No one else is critical. All right. So let's run through the rest of these. Would anyone else be considered a dictator? And the answer to that one is no. The highest weight is 47, quota is 65. So even our national party, no, not the, even the Scottish National Party could not pass a measure by themselves. So there is no dictator. Okay. Would anyone have veto power? All right, so the quickest way to determine if someone has veto power is to find the player that has the most weight. They are the most likely to have veto power, and let everyone else team up. Right? So if all of these guys were to team up, let's see how many votes we would get. So we got 46 plus 17 plus 16 plus 2. And they would have enough votes. All right, so even if player 1 decided to bow out, the other 4 parties could agree to pass a measure, and they could get it done with just them. Okay, so there is no one that has veto power here, because if player 1 doesn't have veto power, then none of the other ones are going to have veto power because they don't have as much weight as player 1 to begin with. So no vetoes. All right, would anyone be considered a dummy? And the answer to this one is actually no, and I'll show you why. Okay. So if we considered the coalition, player 1, player 4, and player 5. All right, so here's my coalition, and if I were to tally up the number of votes that this particular coalition has, they would have exactly 65 votes. Okay. Now let's say player 5 gets upset here, and they decide to leave, right? Player 5 only has 2 votes, so if anyone's going to be a dummy, it's him. But in this particular scenario, if these 3 were to team up, player 5's 2 votes are needed, because if he leaves, they drop down to 63, and all of a sudden, they're not a winning coalition. So player 5 is essential for this scenario. All right? So there are no dummies. Right. And now that we know about coalitions and what they are, we can better define what a dictator is and what veto power is and what a dummy is. So a dictator is any player that can create a single player coalition and containing them as a winning coalition. A player has veto power if they are critical in every winning coalition. Right? So if you were to make a list of all the winning coalitions, uh, if there is a player that is critical in every single one of them, that player has veto power. And then the last one, a dummy, right? If a dummy is not critical in any winning coalition, right, or if there's a player that's not critical in any winning coalition, they are considered a dummy. So if you can find even just one coalition where they are critical, they're not a dummy. All right, guys, that's enough for today. I'm going to stop the video there and we'll continue this discussion on Wednesday. Have a great day.